Hi, in this video I'll be talking about the more advanced concepts of materialized queries, where we build up a warehouse with referential tables and consolidated data, and also introducing concepts like delta refresh. Let's select Materialized Query and go into our database. Here's a database I created earlier, and we'll go into the tables, and the first step would be to create a referential table. What I'll use is SAP Business One, which has two companies, so I'm just going to select both of these, and I'm going to create the referential table over the chart of accounts. I'll bring out the company and the account code, account name, and the account type, and other interesting fields that might be useful for this referential table. Once you've defined the outputs, let's now create an index by specifying the sort order. So we'll come into sorting, and the index that we'd like to create over this table would be by the company and the account code. We don't want to specify any filters because we want all the accounts for these two companies. Let's go OK, and now you can see it's automatically picked up the name chart of accounts and given it a code. Other than that, this table's ready to go. So there's our first table. Now we'll create a consolidated view of the ledger. So I'll click on New, select SAP Business One, and just as before, we'll select both companies, and the table will be the transaction table. And we don't want to get all the transactions, we'd like to consolidate it up. So we'll bring the company out into the outputs, and this is important, but we need the account code because later on we'll join that back to the chart of accounts table, and we'll bring out the period and the amount. Notice I'm not bringing out the details about the accounts because later on the join will give us most of this information. Press OK to this, and I'm just going to change this title to say ledger and press OK. Now these two tables are ready to start querying over, but what I'd like to do now is join the ledger to the chart of accounts. Let's go back into the ledger and go to the table details. In here we want to right click on the account code and select new join. Now the table that we're joining to is the chart of accounts table, so I'm going to select that, and here we have the join builder. So the criteria for joining these two tables together will be company to company and account code to account code. And you can see now that we have a join in here. One other thing that we may want to do is when we filter on the account code, we don't want to get the account codes from the ledger. We'd like to get the complete list from chart of accounts. So let's change the lookup that's on the account code. Just come down to the properties and go into lookup, and in here we have an inherit. So we'll select inherit, and then we'll select the table, and we'd like to inherit the lookup that's on the chart of accounts and on the account code. This way we'll get a complete list irrespective of there being a transaction or not for that account. Just go back to the main query that drives this because I forgot to put in an index on the ledger. So let's go into the sorting again and specify that the index should always be on the company, the account code, and the period, and that will refresh the data. Let's see what this looks like when we come in through Query Builder and produce a report. Starting up Query Builder, once the ledger and the chart of accounts have been joined together, we can start producing reports. So instead of SAP Business One, let's choose the Materialized Query table, and have a look at the ledger table. You can see here we've got the company, the account, and we've got a joined chart of accounts. So let's create a query where we actually bring out some of the details like the account type and the account name and the period and the amount, and we preview that. If you're curious as to what the SQL is doing, you can come in and view it through debug, and you can see that the join criteria that we created before is appearing where the company code is and the account is the same. When materialized queries are created, Sharperlight will create a database with a unique ID, and as we've just created two new tables, I'll just refresh that, and you can see that they're appearing inside that database. If we were to deploy this to another site, all we would have to do is back up this database and restore it on the target system, and that would be all that's required. I mentioned about the indexing, so if we had a look at the indexes on these tables, you'd see that they're automatically created based on those sort orders. You could also add your own custom indexes, and they would be preserved as well. Let's move on now to delta updates. On the ledger, we output the company, the account code, and the period, and the initial query that fed the materialized query got all the transactions out of the transactions table and wrote them into materialized query table. Now, if this table is refreshed, this process may be quite time consuming. So going forward, now that we've loaded the materialized query with most of the transactions, we'd like to get just the last year's worth of transactions or the last period of transactions. So to do that, what we do is come back into the materialized query builder that seeds the query, and we'll change the period so that it just gets the last year's data. So in this case, it's going back to 2012 period 9. So every time we refresh this period's going to be moving forward relative to today's period. The next step would be to come into the options, and we'll select delta replace. When you select delta replace, you need to specify which field the delta replace will be driven by. Now, these are the codes that were allocated to the filters. I'm going to select the year period code, and as we specified that we want to replace the last year's worth of transactions, we'll come over to offsets. Offsets, in the case of periods, can be defined as per the tooltip by saying let's go back a year, 1 year. If the driver was a date, we could use options such as go back 1 month or 1 week, etc. If the driver is some sort of numeric like a journal number, well then we could just say look, let's go back 10 journals and replace that data. We'll refresh the data. Next, I'd like to show you some of the options for updating the tables. If I right click and refresh this table now, I really need to refresh the chart of accounts at the same time. So I'd like to create a dependency between these two tables. Let's have a look at that concept. So I'm going into chart of accounts and looking at the options. Currently there's no trigger for updating the chart of accounts, but what I could say is that this table is triggered by any update of the ledger. So if we were to update the ledger, the chart of accounts would also be updated. Then all we need to do is specify when the ledger should be updated. We'd say it should be updated once a day, and in addition to that we could copy the command line syntax for refreshing this and put it into Windows Scheduler, and we simply schedule this task to run let's say early in the morning. If you're using Materialized Queries in Excel and want to trigger the refresh of the Materialized Query using a button or some sort of macro, you can use the MD refresh MQ table, and you can see here that we've got the database code and the table code. That can be bound to some VBA, and the user can specify that they want to refresh the table on demand. In closing, I'd just like to talk about security. If the underlying system has a security model, then we need to be careful about which counts are used to refresh the Materialized Query. Otherwise, they may get a subset based on the account that we're refreshing it. So you can specify in the refresh data user account an alternative account that will ensure that you get the complete set when the table's refreshed. That concludes a more in-depth look at Materialized Queries.